Rashi explains to us that the menorah was lit from fire on the Mizbeach, which teaches us, firstly, a very interesting insight into how to interpret the Psukim. Secondly, an interesting halachic perspective on where the light of the menorah has to come from, and a great lesson in terms of the balance of our own spiritual development. From Pasuk, the Pasuk at the beginning of our parasha, which says Eish Tamid Tugal on the Mizbeach lo yisichbe, that there has to be a permanent fire on the Mizbeach lo yisichbe that should never be extinguished. So literally, you would think that just simply is telling us that there should always be fire on the Mizbeach. Is Rashi matik deverta Eish Tamid? Rashi quotes the words Eish Tamid, a consistent fire, and his Meforish he explains this. What it means is Eish shenemar bo Tamid, that fire that the Torah describes and defines as a consistent fire, hu shemadikim bo saneros. That is the fire that you use to go and light the menorah. Shenemar ba, because when it comes to the menorah, it uses the same expression. Laha lois ner tamid. That the goal is that you should light a consistent light on the menorah. So it's almost like a hekesh. It says tamid about the fire on the mizbech. It says tamid about the fire on the menorah. That tells us the fire on the menorah comes from the fire on the mizbech. So therefore says Rashi, even that flame which is on the menorah also comes from the mizbech. That's Rashi's comment. Now, Bepashas Lendman, at first glance, it would seem that what Rashi is teaching us is Hazashi made the bavorin and vort tamid. That Rashi is he's addressing why it says the word tamid over here in this pasuk, because at first glance it actually seems to be unnecessary to have the word tamid consistent in this pasuk. Because if the goal of the word tamid over here is that we should know that the fire on the mizbeach should burn and burn without interruption, it would have been enough for the pasuk to say the fire that burns on the mizbeach should never be extinguished. Like an earlier pasuk says, that the fire should not be extinguished. Obviously, if it should not be extinguished, I know that it has to burn all the time. So why do I need the word tamid? Vos gitzu in dem devar tamid. How does the word tamid constantly add anything that we don't already know about the instruction of the Torah that this fire should not be extinguished? That's why Rashi says, okay, the tamid over here has an extra word, must be referring to something else. Where else do we see a fire that is tamid? Oh, the menorah must be relating to the menorah. We see that the menorah is called a constant lamp, as tukad hadlaka, that the lighting of that menorah comes from Eisham Mizbeach. We now put the story together and we say the lighting of that menorah has to come from this fire that is consistent, i.e. the fire of the Mizbeach. Okay, so that's what Rashi is doing, addressing the extra word tamid in the pasuk. Or so it would appear. The only thing is that's not so clear. Number one, Aleph. The ganze parasha do redt wegen dem Mizbeach v'inyonav. The entire context of this area of Torah is describing the Mizbeach and specifically the nature of the fire on the Mizbeach. Koilo wegen Eishef and Mizbeach. Why now would we have a law that is related to the menorah? We're not talking about the menorah over here, not even in this parasha. So why would this be the place to learn about how you light the menorah? Doesn't seem logical. Das, as the pasuk is most of the word tamid. You're going to say, but there's an extra word here, and we have to find meaning for it. Why does it say tamid? We can give a very simple explanation for that. As the pasuk sagt, that the Torah wants us to really have clarity about how important it is that the fire on the mizbeach is constant, and not only by telling us the negative, don't extinguish it, but also in a positive way to tell us that the nature of the fire that burns on the mizbeach is that it has to be constant and never interrupted. And in fact, that's how, as the Even Ezra was von die Rosh Pashtonei Mikro, one of the most leading commentators of the pshat understanding of the pasuk, tells us as the word tamid could most of sein dominion von tamidus beim eish von mizbeach, says clearly that the word tamid over here is to teach us the consistency and the constant nature of the fire that has to be on the mizbeach. So that's pshat enough. Why do we have to dig around and look for another meaning to the word tamid? You're going to say Rashi didn't make this up, he bases it on a Gemara in Yuma and on various other midrashim. Is doch Yudua we know very well, V'shengret Filmol, because we've discussed it many times, as a film Droshe Chazal, was Rashi bringt ze befirushe al Torah, that even if Rashi should quote something from Chazal in his commentary, Zaina Muchach Bipshuto Shel Mikra, that will always be because that particular interpretation is necessary from a pshat perspective. Why is it necessary from a pshat perspective over here to interpret that the word tamid relates to the menorah, which has nothing to do with the context of this discussion? Or befrat, wenn der Pirish wird in Pirish Rashi, nit gebrach mit Lashon Rabbi Seine Dorsha b'chayotze bazeh. Now, anytime Rashi does not introduce a commentary by saying it is from Chazal, was von dem ist verstandig, als der Pirish ist noch mehr muchach vom Pshat HaKsuvim atzmoi. That implies that this interpretation is clearly necessary from a pshat understanding of the psukim. So, from a pshat understanding of the psukim, for whatever reason, tamid has to relate to the menorah. And our question is, why? Why would you relate it to the menorah? Beis Nochmer, beyond that, Rashi aleinot frime farish given. Rashi previously explained, as in the previous pasuk, as riba kan yakidois harbe. That in the description of the Mizbeach, the Torah actually used the concept of making a hearth, making a place to burn fire, more than once. It says, Al moikto, veish al Mizbeach tukad boy, veho'esh al Mizbeach tukad boy, eish tomi tukad al Mizbeach. 4 different occasions where it speaks about igniting a fire on the Mizbeach, including our pasuk Vav, this pasuk we're looking at. And then he says, Kulan nidushu b'Masechta Yuma. They're all explained in Masechta Yuma. Shenechluku Rabbi Seinu b'minyan hamarochi shahayu sham. That there were debates between the sages of the Gemara. How many pyres, how many fireplaces were there on the Mizbeach? Dos heist. Now when you look at that, you can see clearly, as the pasuk Eish Tamid Tukad v'Goimer, that pasuk that says that a constant fire, our pasuk that we're analyzing, pasuk Vav, that says that there has to be a constant fire burning on the Mizbeach, is talking about one of the 4 different fireplaces on the Mizbeach. Rashi says that. Why is Rashi now saying that a pasuk, which he, just one pasuk previously, said is to describe one of the fireplaces on the Mizbeach, now is saying that same pasuk is to teach us you light the menorah from the fire of the Mizbeach? Why change your tune? Gimel Nochmer, and even beyond that. In dem pasuk Gufa is Rashi gleich mefarish as siyumai lo sichbe gate of an Mizbeach. In our pasuk, after he says tamid refers to the menorah, he then says lo sichbe, do not extinguish what? Not the light of the menorah, do not extinguish the light of the Mizbeach. So it seems like a kind of haphazard Rashi, and very much out of place. So let's try another interpretation. It's not just simply that the word tamid bothers him because it's extra in the pasuk. There are certain Mefarshim who give the following explanation, which perhaps would suit us. As the pasuk if you only look at this pasuk alone, without the context, just this pasuk about the burning of the fire on the Mizbeach, so then you could say, is Rashi nit moitze midei pshuta? The ganze pasuk wegen dem Arochai von Mizbeach. Rashi sees the pasuk in its simplest interpretation. We're talking about the fire on the Mizbeach. That's how Rashi understands this pasuk and its meaning. But Rashi kommt noch bevor sein as von dem Wort Tommy da beim Mizbeach von an Oplening auf Menorah. In addition to the fact that the pasuk in its entirety describes the fire on the Mizbeach, there is also the word Tamid, which is an additional reference also to teach us about how you light the menorah from the fire of the Mizbeach. And the link is, because also the light of the menorah is described with the word tamid, that links it to this tamid, which is the light of the fire of the Mizbeach. So you ignite the menorah from the fire of the Mizbeach. Okay, so maybe that's the explanation. Rashi sees that this pasuk generally is talking about the Mizbeach, and it's also giving me information about the menorah. Maybe that's the explanation. But that too has 3 problems associated with it. It's difficult to explain that that's what Rashi is saying. Reason number 1. If that is what Rashi wanted to say, that the pasuk generally is talking about the Mizbech and the word Tamid is the link to the menorah, Rashi would have used an expression that says from here, from this word Tamid, either our sages learned or we have learned that there's also a reference over here to the menorah. He doesn't say that. Base number 2. Rashi is matik from pasuk Eichne Wort Eish. If Rashi only wanted to explain that the word Tamid links to the menorah, then only the word Tamid should have been the headline of this Rashi. But actually Rashi uses the words Eish, Tamid. Why is the word Eish in there? Und euch bei Firushai, Teitschaft zusammen mit dem Wort Tamid, euch dem Wort Eish. And look at how Rashi explains it. He doesn't only explain the meaning of the word Tamid as inconsistency. He explains Eish shenemar ba Tamid. He links the word fire to this word Tamid. Das heißt, dass Tamid is metair dem Eish, was steht da in Pasuk. In other words, Rashi is telling us that the word Tamid is actually there to describe the fire that is being spoken about in this Pasuk, and that fire, according to this interpretation, is the fire of the Mizbeach. So how would it link to the menorah? And Gimel, lastly, for Narichas Saloshim Bepirish Rashi. Rashi's elaborate language over here. Af he, even the light of the menorah, me'ala Mizbeach HaChitzon, to Kod, should also, from the fire of the external Mizbeach, be lit. Rashi is clearly reading that into those words, to Kod ala Mizbeach, Eish Tamid to Kod ala Mizbeach. Not only the word Tamid, he's talking about the whole thing, because look how he says it, me'ala Mizbeach to Kod. So we're back to square one. How does Rashi get from a pasuk that ostensibly is just talking about the fire on the Mizbeach being a consistent fire that should never be extinguished, to learning how you light the menorah? So there are other commentaries who say, well, there seems to be a contradiction between how Rashi says things in Pasuk Hey, where he says there are 4 fireplaces and they're referred to by 4 psukim, and what he says in Pasuk Vav, that this Pasuk Eish Tamid is actually talking about the menorah. So some of the commentaries want to reconcile by saying as follows: as the Pasuk Eish Tamid to Kadal Mizbeach, this pasuk that we're reading that says that there should be a constant fire burning on the Mizbeach, Vertin Masechta Yuma nit gedarshent benegea de marochis was darfen sein auf dem Mizbeach, is actually not included in that conversation in Masechta Yuma about the different fireplaces that sat on the Mizbeach. Nor men lent up alle marochis from the Friedike Pesukim, but instead we learn all of the various fireplaces that stood on the menorah from the preceding Pesukim, not from this pasuk. Und das, was Rashi sagt, kulon nishtum nidrushum Masechta Yuma v'chulei. And the fact that Rashi said all of the marachos are described and interpreted in Yuma, b'minyan ha-marachos, to work out how many fireplaces are on the Mizbeach, so as nor letzayin ba'velche inyan u'masechta chazal dashen di psukim. Rashi is only giving that to us as a hyperlink. That's where you look if you want to see where Chazal was speaking about how many marachos, how many fireplaces there were, and which psukim teach us that. But Rashi wasn't telling us that Eish Tamid to Kadal Mizbeach is actually one of those psukim. We know Rashi is a lot more precise than that. Considering that we know how Rashi is so impeccable in his language usage, is moving as Tiritz is in ganzen Yishplatik, that tells you that this answer certainly cannot fly. If Rashi's whole intention was to give us an indication where you could find the conversation amongst Chazal about the psukim that teach us how many marachos there were, Rashi would have simply have said, you can find the whole discussion about this in Yuma, as he does very often. He wouldn't have had to tell us, look how many times it says Yekidos, Harbe. He wouldn't have told us that they're arguing about the Marach. He would have said, it's all explained over there in Yuma. Go have a look. Und bemeile muss man annehmen, as das Rashi sagt, nechlu Rabbi Senim b'minyan ha-Marach is negea lefirushai. So we have to conclude that when Rashi tells us that there is a debate as to how many fireplaces there were on the Mizbech, that is critical to what Rashi is trying to tell us. So what is Rashi trying to tell us? The Birbos, the real explanation is this. When you come across the word Tamid, it's not the first time we have encountered it. We already know it from other places in the Torah. So we already have a working definition for what Tamid means. The Birbos, dem Teichen from word Tamid, is Rashi Meforish freer by the menorah. Rashi has already explained to us previously when it comes to the menorah, and we're described about the menorah, Parshas Tzav, about lighting the menorah, and it says that that's got to be lahalus ner tamid. Rashi explains over there, what does tamid mean? Kol laila ve'laila karo tamid. Each night means that it is a constant light. It doesn't have to be lit 24/7. As long as it is regularly lit every single night, that qualifies as tamid. And he proves it, Rashi. Like we'll see later on in Parshas Pinchas, Oilas Tamid talks about the Tamid offering that was brought every morning and every evening. It was only once a day, and yet it's called Tamid. Likewise with the special chavitin offering that the Kohen God used to bring, it says Tamid. It also says that it was Tamid, but even though it was only half a portion in the morning, half a portion in the evening, it wasn't constantly through the course of the day. So the word Tamid does not have to mean constant. It means consistent, always at the same time. Now that we know that Rashi interprets the word Tamid as regular rather than constant, then you cannot tell me that Rashi's interpretation is as der word Tamid benididan could most sein binyan atmidius bisman evdem was the pasuk sagt es tukad lo sichbe. Well, then you definitely can't say that Rashi believes that the word Tamid in this pasuk is to add and to highlight the constant nature of the fire on the Mizbeach over and above the fact that you don't extinguish it. Varim adra, because logic tells you the exact opposite. Lo sichbe, when you tell me that I may not extinguish the Mizbeach, meint as the eish darf brennen on iberais. That means that that fire has to burn 24/7, 365 without interruption. That I learned from Loi Sichbe. It should never be extinguished, may never be extinguished. But the word Tamid, as Rashi has already taught us in Parshas Tzav, ken meinen euch die Tamidus von Yomim allein, or the Leiles allein, could just mean it's regular, as long as that fire burns every single day. It doesn't have to burn the whole day, or every single night. It doesn't have to burn the whole night. Und in sein Guf of Oilas Tamid, nicht im ganzen Yom oder Leila, as we learn from Oilas Tamid, does not have to be the full day or the full night. So Rashi does not see the word Tamid as a word that teaches constant. Therefore, Rashi has to say, okay, so I already know that you may not extinguish this light, this fire. So what's Tamid teaching me? Tamid sounds like it's less than that. On the Rebbe lernt Rashi as mit dem Pasuk eish Tamid. Therefore, Rashi says the word Tamid there is a link to something else. Kommt der Torah marben sein an ander eish. That extra word Tamid is there to link to another concept of Tamid. As mit dafür madig sein mel Mizbeach, that the menorah has to be lit from the Mizbeach, because the word Tamid does not suit the context of a constant fire on the Mizbeach. It must be talking about something else. With that in mind, we can understand why Rashi gives more information than we thought we needed. Now we understand when Rashi in Pasuk Hey, the preceding Pasuk, told us that there are many fireplaces referred to on the Mizbeach. Then he does a few things. Number one, Aleph. He doesn't just make a statement that the Torah refers over here to multiple fireplaces and then expect that we'll work it out, because it says he specifically numbers or lists each of the psukim, including our pasuk of Eish Tamid, not from the word Tamid, but from the Lo Sichbe, that we'll learn it can never go out, and from the Eish Tamid we'll learn that from the word Tukad we'll learn that you have to put another fireplace, or at least according to some opinions. Number two, that's why Rashi gives us more information, that the Torah specifically gave many reference to many fireplaces, where he could have just simply said he could have just said 4. He doesn't say it. He specifically says many. We'll see a little bit later why that is. Number 3, Gimel, not only does he say, and this is all explained in detail in Masechta Yoma, but he adds to it, is a moisif, a key piece of information, that there's a running debate between the sages about how many fireplaces there were, in fact, on the Mizbeach. Because a big part of what Rashi wants to share with us over here is that how we explain Eish Tamid to Kadal Mizbeach Lo Sichbe hinges on which opinion we go with in the Gemara Yuma about how many fireplaces there were on the Mizbeach. What did Rashi say? Here, the Torah includes many possibilities of how many fireplaces there would be. So logically, if riba kan, Rashi is telling us, logically you should imagine that every one of the fires that is being described over here must relate to the Mizbeach. So who is that? Which opinion would see it in that way? That all of the psukim over here speaking about igniting are all specifically speaking about fire on the Mizbeach. That would follow the opinion in Yuma, who says there were 4 different fireplaces every single day on the Mizbeach. Over Meile, if there are 4 fireplaces according to that view, is euch der Pasuk Eish Tamid to Kadal Mizbeach Nichla mit die Psukim was regen wegen Marochas HaMizbeach. Then that view would say Eish Tamid to Kadal Mizbeach is one of the 4 Psukim that allude to the 4 different fireplaces. According to that opinion, Rashi wouldn't have to worry about the word Tamid because it's already accounted for. It's one of the Psukim that describes one of the different fireplaces that was on the Mizbeach, and that's great. Okay, Rashi would have an issue. So what about the word Tamid? Because he's already previously explained that Tamid doesn't necessarily have to mean constant. So he would go with the opinion of the Even Ezer. That Tamid is coming to highlight how much of an important thing it is that the fire is constant. So that's Rashi interpreting for the opinion in Yuma, which he specifically told us we need to know that there are opinions in Yuma, and we need to know that they are specifically about how many fireplaces there were. And that's why he says Yikido is harbe, that there were many, but he doesn't specify how many because it's a matter of opinion. So according to that opinion that there were 4 fireplaces, I don't have to explain Eish Tamid to Kadal Mizbeach because it's one of the proofs that there should be a 4th fireplace on the Mizbeach. But like the other day, but there are 2 other opinions. One opinion is that there were only 2 fireplaces, the other is that there were 3. It's Rashi Meforish, so for them, Rashi explains, there's another way that they could very comfortably fit within Pshat. Warum kenal is glatige zu sagen, because as we already mentioned, certainly from Rashi's perspective, it makes a lot more sense to say as Eish Tamid red wegen der Menorah, that the word Tamid is not referring to the Mizbeach, because Tamid is a weaker expression than Loi Sichbe. So it refers instead to another fire that is referred to Lahalos Ner Tamid, the Menorah, as Tukat Mel Mizbeach, that the Menorah should be lit from the Mizbeach. Das is the Pirush al Pi Pshuto Shel Mikra, and that would be the simplest explanation and would accommodate 2 of the 3 opinions in Yuma. And that's why Rashi doesn't put a number on how many pyres there were, because it's harbe, there are many, depending on who you look at. One opinion says 2, one opinion says 3, one opinion says 4. So that's Rashi's explanation. It accommodates all the various opinions in the Gemara Yuma, which explains why he referred to the Gemara Yuma in so much detail. So now we know how Rashi interprets in Pshat this pasuk, that Tamid is not an expression for how much the fire has to be on the Mizbeach, but rather for how you use that fire to light the Mizbeach, to light the Menorah. Now that we know that, we're going to do an analysis. So we've now stated from Rashi's perspective an halachic principle that you have to light the Menorah from fire on the Mizbeach. Let's examine that halachic principle in greater detail. So one of the amazing halachic insights that Rashi offers us is in this particular area, and it speaks to a bigger concept. By Kama Dinim, in many halachas, we have a question. Many areas of halacha have 2 factors that rely on each other. One, almost as if one can't be without the other. So we always have the following question: Was is the Ike Prat V'Siba? And what is the Prat HaMesubav? What is the cause and what is the effect? In other words, what makes the halacha a particular way, and what is reliant on that principle in order for the halacha to apply? Now that might sound quite abstract, so the Rebbe is going to give us a very clear example. We know that on Shavuos, the only time that you brought chometz as an offering in the Beis Hamikdash, you brought the 2 loaves of Shavuos. Is the din as dos darf sein mincha chadosha. So the flour that is used for those loaves has to come from new grain. From the Tfur Chadasha, the new harvest. Pesach time is harvest time. This has to be the flour that is used from the new harvest. Far die shtei alechem, tomen von Tfur Chadasha, nit makrev sein ken an dem Mincha Beis Hamikdash. Prior to bringing those 2 loaves on Shavuos, you would not be allowed to use flour from the new harvest for any other mincha offering in the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so what do we see? Two things that rely on each other. In order to bring a korban mincha from new flour, you need to have the 2 loaves in the Beis Hamikdash on Shavuos. Now the question is, which is the focal point and which is the supporting halacha? Stellt sich der Shaila. So here's the question. Was ist dort der Ike v'Sibba? What is the primary cause of this halachic interplay? Si das is die Shtei halechem, is the primary focus the 2 loaves on Shavuos. Azay müssen sein die erste Mincha von der Neue Tvor. That the most important thing is that the first item that is brought in the Beis Hamikdash from new grain has to be these 2 loaves of bread. And then after that you can do whatever you want. Und als Mesuvo von dem Tormen Fadem nicht makriv sein Chodesh kein anderer Mincha. So practically, because these have to be the first 2 that are using the new grain, therefore nothing else could be brought until you have brought the Shtei Alechem. One possibility. Or it's a completely different halachic status. In order to bring a korban mincha from new grain, there has to be something that permits that grain to be used for mincha. In order to be allowed to bring a korban mincha from new grain, you will have first had to have brought the 2 loaves from new grain. Das heißt, das was die Shtei Alechem seien die erste von die Tvur Chadasha. In other words, the fact that the 2 loaves of Shavuos are from the first grains is as it's not because they have to be the first 2 that are used with new grain, but rather because they are the key to unlock all the other menachos to be used with new grain. Now this will have practical implications. It will affect many areas. We'll look at a couple of areas. Number 1, let's look at a scenario. What happens if somebody mistakenly brought a korban mincha with new grain before Shavuos? So now, does that mean going forward, the rule has been broken, and now we can bring other menachos from the new grain? Or can we still not bring new menachos? We have to still wait for Shavuos for the Shtei Alechem. So it depends on how you look at this. If the logic is that the Shtei Alechem have to be the first product brought in the Beis Hamikdash with new grain, well, now it's impossible for the Shtei Alechem to be the first thing brought with the new grain because something's already been brought with the new grain. Is b'meila shein yeshayach kenisser in them. So now there's no longer a problem of bringing the next mincha from new grain because you've already broken the possibility of the Shtei Alechem being the first items used with the new grain. And therefore go ahead and you can bring as many menachos from new grains as you wish. But if the logic is the 2 breads of Shavuos unlock the possibility of bringing menachos from new grains, so you messed up with that mincha, you shouldn't have done it, but the ban is still in place for the next mincha. You may not bring the next mincha from new grain until those 2 loaves have been brought because only they can unlock permission to bring menachos from new grains. As long as you haven't brought those 2 breads of Shavuos, you haven't yet opened the green light channel to bring menachos from new grains. So using that logic, where depending on what is the focal point of an halachic principle, let's look at the story of lighting the menorah from the fire of the Mizbeach. We could ask a similar question. Rashi tells us that you have to light the menorah from the fire of the external Mizbeach. Now, is this a law in the rules of how to light the menorah? As the that part of the parameters of how the menorah works is that the light of the menorah must derive from the light of the Mizbeach. Or this is something that was discussed in the Torah in context of the Mizbeach, and therefore it's a halacha that is relevant to the Mizbeach. In other words, from the Mizbeach is where you have to find light for the menorah. So what's the practical difference? What happens if, hypothetically, There's no fire burning on the Mizbeach. Does that mean I cannot light the menorah now? Because you told me that the lighting the menorah has to come from the fire of the Mizbeach. So now there's no fire in the Mizbeach. Do I light the menorah or not? So if it's a defining rule about the menorah, then a menorah has to be lit from fire on the Mizbeach. If there is no fire on the Mizbeach, you can't light the menorah, because the rule of the menorah is it has to be lit from the fire of the Mizbeach. There is no such fire, you cannot light it. But if instead this is a halacha that is defining the role of the Mizbeach, the role of the Mizbeach is to ignite the menorah. So then, let's say there is no fire on the Mizbeach for whatever reason, then there's no longer responsibility to light the menorah specifically from the fire of the Mizbeach. And now you could light the menorah from any other fire source. Practical difference. So if you look at this at face value, the logical thing would be to say this must be a law about a menorah. You're telling me how to light the menorah. So logically, it must be a halacha about the menorah. So if there's no fire in the Mizbeach, cancel the menorah. As daf kommen from Mizbeach HaChitzon, because the fire of the menorah has to always come from the Mizbeach HaChitzon. But when you notice that Rashi states this commentary in different language to how the Gemara and Yuma said it, what did the Gemara Yuma say? That constant fire for the menorah that I instructed you, says Hashem, may not come from anywhere other than the head, the top of the Mizbeach HaChitzon. That implies that it's absolutely required for the menorah. Rashi doesn't do that. He changes. Unschreibt, Rashi says, Rashi says, also the light of the menorah comes from the fire of the Mizbeach. So Rashi implies that in his view, it's actually part of the halacha of the Mizbeach. As Zain Eish, that it has fire for its own purpose, to be the fire of the Mizbeach, and then Darf Oich, wie andere Yekidus do, Zain der was von em wird gezündet in der Eish HaMenorah. In addition, it also has a role to be the fire from which you light the menorah. Almost like a secondary responsibility or secondary value. The truth is that the simplest reading of the Psukim sounds very much like what Rashi is saying. The fact that the Torah chose to teach me about lighting the menorah from the Mizbeach, not in the section that talks about the menorah, but specifically in the section that talks about the Mizbeach, that must tell me that it is part of the halachic status of the Mizbeach, not of the menorah. So we've learned how Rashi interprets the words Eish Tamid Tukan on Mizbeach, and that it's specifically teaching us Tamid is not a strong enough word to be teaching about the fire of the Mizbeach being constant, so therefore it's teaching us about the menorah, which also is called Tamid. And we've learned the incredible halachic insight that it is part of the parameters of the halacha of the Mizbeach, and therefore if you don't have access to the fire of the Mizbeach, you could still light the menorah. What could it teach us on a personal level? You could pretty much divide all of the implements in the Beis HaMikdash and prior to that in the Mishkan into two groups. There were those implements that were internal inside the building of the in those days the Oyel Moed, and subsequently in the Heichal, like the menorah that was used, the golden menorah for Keteris, the golden Mizbeach for Keteris, the menorah, the Shulchan. And then you have another class of implements, which is essentially Mizbeach HaChitzon. The Mizbeach HaChitzon may be other things like the Kior, etc. In Avodas Ha'adam Zainen is Ditzvei Oifane Avodah. Of course, the whole concept of the Beis HaMikdash is supposed to represent the concept of how we serve Hashem. Two groups, two categories of how we serve Hashem. There's the Avodah Mitzvah Lein Bifnim. There's the internal work that each of us has to do with our own selves, our personal growth. And the avoid that we do outside of our own self, which is to reach and touch another Jew. So to draw close those people who are outside of the precinct of the Beis HaMikdash, like the Mizbech that was outdoors. And was dafka FM hat mir makriv gewend die Karbonis von alle Eden. And specifically the Mizbeach HaChitzon is where every Jew participated, because every Jew brought karbanos over there. So everybody had a connection over there. And das der Ort von Birur Inyonei Ha'olam, and that is the place where you took physical items of this world and you elevated them to have a connection to godliness. So there are two areas of avodah that we all have to have: avodah with ourselves and avodah with others, and by extension with the world out there. Or befrati yoser, you can make that even more specific. Lighting the menorah represents Torah study. Mitzvah v'Torah or. And if them steht lahalis ner tamid, and that's why when it comes to lighting the menorah, it says that it has to be a constant light v'chiv tamid Torah, because studying Torah is something which you have to do all the time. Mashenke mitzvahs, whereas mitzvahs are relevant in certain circumstances and at certain times. For sure, somebody who is fully dedicated 24 hours a day to Torah learning, that's for sure the eish tamid. So if you have that constant engagement with Torah, you have a constant connection to Hashem. Therefore, a person who sits and learns could have the following argument. Here's a person, I'm in Klei Kodesh, I'm in a holy environment. And I could be somebody who is this consistently lit menorah illuminating the world. Constantly elevating. What do I have to do with mitzvahs? I'm connected through Torah. Even a mitzvah that is going to pass and I won't be able to get it back, like saying Shema in the morning or Lulav and Esrog on the Sukkot or whatever. I don't need it. I'm connected already. That's what the person would think. If a person convinces themselves that they don't need the individual mitzvahs, they certainly will convince themselves, what I have to do with the rest of the world? And what I have to do with another Jew who, relative to my holy status, is out there in the outside. If them kommt der Heira, so therefore we have a lesson in our parasha. As the menorah darf angezündet werden von Mizbeach. What lights the menorah? You think the menorah is so holy, which it is, but what lights the menorah? The Mizbeach and the external Mizbeach. Und avada is dort the Mizbeach apnimi, because we know that there is an internal, apparently holier Mizbeach, or at least appears to be holy because it's in a holier space, which is der avodah nalis v'naiden mit sich. That represents the tremendous avodah that a person could do in their personal self-growth. But you don't light the menorah from the internal mizbeach, even though they're right next to each other. Even though that is the avodah of a very deep, meaningful connection to Hashem with a tremendous sentiment. That's not where you light the menorah. Now, dafka for mizbeach hachitzon. We specifically choose to light the menorah from the outer Mizbeach. Nochmer, besides that, if you look at how Rashi explains it, you'll see as der eish noch zeindig of the Mizbeach hachitzon, not only do you light the menorah from the fire of the outside Mizbeach, but the fire while it is outside on that Mizbeach is a shoin verbunden mit der menorah, is already linked to the menorah's fire. In the meaning von avodah sa'adam, which basically means in practical terms, in terms of our growth and connection to Hashem, if a person who is dedicated to studying Torah wants the light and fire of Torah to ignite within his learning, then the first step is to be concerned, genuinely concerned, that another Jewish person who is outside of the space of the Torah, outside of the space of the Beis HaMikdash, should ignite his neshama. And after you have ignited the light of that Jew who is so-called outside, only then can you really light the light of your own menorah, your own Torah learning. That connection that Rashi highlights for us, the link between the menorah and the outer Mizbeach. So that you should care about what lies outside of the safety of the Mishkan. So if Azefil Nageh should mean so much to you, as das wird nirmals in unser Pasuk mit dem Wort Tamid, that it is alluded to in our Pasuk with the word Tamid. Warum der Inyan von Tamid, the notion, the meaning, the message of Tamid, which means that Tamidius and the avodah von Yoshev oil, the consistency of the avodah and connection of the person who's dedicated their lives to Torah study, wird bei ihm aufgetan dafke durch dem, was geht durch euch Nisenes und Schwierigkeiten von Chutz. What creates the permanence of a person's connection within the walls of the yeshiva? The challenges, or tackling the challenges of what lives outside the walls of the yeshiva, or the Beis HaMikdash in this case. And then when a person takes on the responsibility of having an impact on other Jews around them, that is what creates permanence and sustainability of a person's own learning. So everybody thinks, if I wrap myself up in a closed space and I learn Torah, that's what will connect and that's what will give me sustainable Yiddishkeit. Not at all. It's when you reach out and touch somebody else who's not privileged to have that experience, that consolidates your own experience of Torah learning.